Moving into our new home was supposed to be a fresh start, a peaceful, welcoming place where my family could finally settle down. Nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The houses were pristine, the lawns neatly trimmed, and the streets lined with towering oaks that swayed gently in the breeze. It felt like the perfect place to raise my son, Ethan. Ethan had always been a bright, loving kid, but his world was different from most. Diagnosed with severe anxiety and sensory processing disorder, everyday tasks that others took for granted were overwhelming for him. Crowds, sudden noises, and even simple social interactions could send him into panic attacks. That was why Max, his service dog, wasn't just a pet. He was essential. A loyal golden retriever with years of specialized training, Max provided grounding pressure during meltdowns, guided Ethan through overstimulation, and helped him navigate a world that often felt too chaotic. When we first arrived, everything seemed perfect. The neighborhood was clean, quiet, and well-maintained thanks to the Homeowners Association. At least, that's what I thought. I had heard stories about overzealous HOAs, but I brushed them off. After all, we weren't the kind of people to break rules or cause trouble. If anything, we just want to blend in and enjoy our new home. But I quickly learned that our presence, and more specifically Max's presence, was a problem. It started with a letter, a crisp white envelope tucked neatly into our mailbox, stamped with the official HOA logo. At first, I assumed it was just a standard welcome notice, maybe a list of community guidelines. Instead, it was a violation notice. The letter stated that pets over a certain weight were prohibited, and that we were expected to remove Max from the property immediately. A fine of $50 had already been issued, with the warning that additional penalties would follow if the unauthorized pet was not removed. I stood on my porch, rereading the letter as my stomach twisted. This had to be a misunderstanding. Service animals weren't just pets. They were protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Surely, a simple conversation would clear things up. At least, that's what I thought. I was wrong. The next morning, I decided to handle the situation calmly and professionally. I walked to the HOA office, a small but pristine brick building at the entrance of our neighborhood, and requested to speak with the president. That's when I met Linda Crawford. She was exactly the kind of person you'd expect to be running an HOA, immaculately dressed, hair styled into a tight bob, and an expression that suggested she took immense pride in enforcing rules. When I explained that Max was a trained service animal and legally allowed to stay with us, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand your concern," she said in a voice dripping with forced politeness, "but our bylaws clearly state that no dogs over 25 pounds are permitted. Exceptions are not outlined." I felt my patience slipping. Federal law protects service animals regardless of HOA rules. This isn't just a pet. He's medically necessary for my son. She barely blinked. Our policies are in place to maintain the integrity of the community. We've had no issues before, and I won't make an exception now. You'll need to remove the dog immediately or face further penalties. My hands clenched at my sides. That's illegal. She smiled, actually smiled. Then feel free to take it up with our legal team. And just like that, the conversation was over. I went home fuming, determined not to let this slide. I gathered official documentation, doctor's notes, Max's certification papers, and legal protections under the ADA. I sent them via email, then printed copies and personally delivered them to the HOA office. Days passed, and instead of resolution, I received another letter. This time, the fine had increased to $200. I wasn't just angry now, I was livid. I reached out to a lawyer, who confirmed what I already knew. The HOA was in the wrong. He sent them a formal notice, demanding they cease their actions against us. But Linda, apparently enjoying the power trip, didn't back down. The next fine arrived, then another, each one steeper than the last. Then came the threats. A final notice warned that if I didn't comply, they would pursue legal action to evict us for repeated violations. My heart pounded as I read the words, disbelief giving way to a cold, simmering rage. They were trying to bully us out of our home, and I wasn't about to let that happen. The next few weeks were a relentless cycle of stress, frustration, and anger. Every time I checked the mailbox, another fine or violation notice awaited me. The total amount they claimed I owed had ballooned into the thousands, and the HOA had made it clear they weren't stopping until I either got rid of Max or left. I wasn't the only one affected. Ethan, always sensitive to changes in routine, could sense the tension. He started withdrawing, his usual cautious smiles disappearing, replaced by anxious glances whenever mail arrived or when I was on the phone with lawyers. Max did his best to comfort him, pressing his warm body against Ethan's side during meltdowns, but even he couldn't shield my son from the growing hostility around us. It wasn't just coming from the HOA. The neighborhood itself had started to turn. At first, I assumed people would rally behind us. Who could possibly side against a child with a service animal? But Linda had been working behind the scenes, spreading misinformation. I overheard snippets of conversations at the community park. I heard they're refusing to follow the rules. If they let one person break them, where does it end? It's not about the kid. It's about them thinking they're above everyone else. I still had supporters, of course. A few neighbors whispered their sympathy, telling me they thought the HOA was overstepping, but none of them spoke up publicly. Fear kept them silent. Fear of fines, of retaliation, of Linda's iron grip over the community. One night, I found a note taped to my door. Follow the rules or leave. That was my breaking point. I had tried reason. I had tried legal avenues. I had tried patience. None of it worked. Linda and her HOA weren't interested in fairness or legality. They wanted control. And if they thought they could intimidate me into submission, they had underestimated the wrong person. I sat down at my computer, opened my financial documents, and started digging. I had resources they didn't know about, and it was time to use them. It started as an idea, a ridiculous, impossible thought born out of sheer desperation. But as I looked at the numbers, researched property sales, and ran calculations, I realized something staggering. A significant number of homes in the neighborhood were either for sale or owned by landlords renting them out. And with the right strategy, I could buy enough of them to gain voting power in the HOA. Linda thought she had control. I was about to take it from her. Once the idea took root, I couldn't ignore it. If I wanted to stop Linda and her HOA tyranny, I needed power, real legal power. And in an HOA, power wasn't just about who yelled the loudest. It was about who owned the most property. I spent the next week researching every home in the neighborhood. Some were owned by families like mine, but a surprising number, almost a third, were investment properties. Landlords who had no real loyalty to Linda or her rules, just an interest in rental income. Others were homeowners who had quietly put their places on the market, either fed up with the HOA or simply looking to move on. I had money, more than Linda could have imagined. Years of smart investments, a successful business, and a recent inheritance had put me in a financial position most wouldn't suspect. And now I was ready to use it. The first purchase was easy. A small rental home near the entrance of the neighborhood had been sitting on the market for months. I paid in cash, closing the deal in record time. One house down. Then came the next, and the next. I worked quickly, targeting homes with motivated sellers, making competitive offers, and securing deals before Linda or the HOA even realized what was happening. Some owners were more than happy to sell, eager to escape the very organization that was now my enemy. Others took some convincing, but money had a way of smoothing things over. Within 2 months, I owned enough properties to become a voting member of the HOA board. Linda still controlled the majority, but just barely. I needed more. That's when I started talking to the other homeowners. Not everyone supported Linda. Many resented the constant fines, the strict rules, the way she ran the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Once I explained my plan to take control and dismantle the most oppressive policies, I found allies, people who had been too afraid to speak up before suddenly had hope. The turning point came when I acquired 3 more properties in a single week, pushing me past the threshold I needed. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in and took my seat at the board table. Linda looked at me, smug as ever, not yet realizing what had changed. I smiled. I think it's time for some new leadership. The room fell silent. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, while Linda's smile barely wavered at first. She leaned forward, lacing her fingers together as if she were entertaining a child's foolish request. New leadership? She echoed, amusement creeping into her voice. And what exactly makes you think that's an option? I slid a stack of documents across the table. Because I now own enough property in this neighborhood to hold a controlling vote. Her face faltered for the first time. She snatched up the papers, her eyes scanning the list of addresses, each one a home I had purchased in the last 2 months. The other board members leaned in, whispering amongst themselves. They understood what Linda refused to believe. I had the majority now. I let the moment sink in before continuing. Effective immediately, I'm calling for a special vote to remove the current HOA president and elect new leadership. Linda's face turned red. You can't do that. One of the other board members, a soft-spoken man named Greg, cleared his throat. Actually, per HOA bylaws, a majority property owner can call for a leadership vote. He turned to me. And you now own over 50% of the investment properties in this neighborhood, correct? I nodded. Linda slammed her hands on the table. This is absurd. You can't just buy your way into power. I leaned back, keeping my voice even. You use your power to find, threaten, and try to force us out. I used mine to put an end to it. I gestured toward the rest of the board. Now, let's vote. The vote was swift and undeniable. With the homeowners I had spoken to backing me, Linda was removed from her position, her mouth open and closed as if she wanted to argue, but no amount of bluster could undo the numbers. She stormed out, heels clicking furiously against the floor, and for the first time since moving in, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. But I wasn't done yet. Within days, I took full control of the HOA board, systematically dismantling Linda's oppressive policies. The fines were voided, ridiculous restrictions revoked, and most importantly, a new rule was implemented. Service animals were explicitly protected in the neighborhood. When I mailed out the updated HOA guidelines, I made sure one copy was hand-delivered to Linda's mailbox, a reminder that the reign of tyranny was officially over. Word spread quickly. The once feared HOA regime had crumbled overnight, and with it, the suffocating grip Linda had maintained over the community. Some residents were ecstatic, relieved that the constant nitpicking and excessive fines were finally over. Others, those who had either supported Linda or feared change, were less thrilled, whispering about how things were getting out of control. But there was no denying one thing. The neighborhood was different now. The first thing I did was erase every fine Linda had imposed unfairly, not just mine but everyone's. Late fees, obscure violations, penalties for mailbox colors being too bold. All of it was gone. People who had once cowered under the HOA's rules started speaking up, sharing their own horror stories. Linda hadn't just been after me. She had been weaponizing the HOA against countless families. One elderly couple revealed that Linda had fined them repeatedly for their unkempt lawn while they had been dealing with a medical emergency. Another family had almost been forced to repaint their entire house because Linda decided the shade of beige wasn't neutral enough. She had ruled through intimidation, and now she had no power left. Linda, of course, didn't take her downfall gracefully. She tried everything: petty complaints, legal threats, even an attempt to challenge the legitimacy of the vote. But the bylaws were clear, and I had done everything by the book. The final blow came when she put her house up for sale. She couldn't stand living in a community she no longer controlled. The day the for sale sign went up in her yard, I took Max for a long walk right past her house, nodding politely as she stood on the porch, arms crossed, glaring daggers at me. Max wagged his tail. I smiled. Linda fumed. Beyond Linda's personal downfall, real changes started happening. With a new, fair HOA board in place, the neighborhood became a place where people actually wanted to live. The ridiculous restrictions were replaced with reasonable, community-approved guidelines. Service animals were formally protected, and a clause was added ensuring no future HOA leadership could override that decision. Most importantly, Ethan was safe. He could walk outside with Max without fear, without me worrying about threats or fines. The weight I had been carrying since we moved in was gone, replaced by something I hadn't felt in months: peace. And as I stood on my porch, watching Ethan and Max play in the front yard, I knew I had won. For the first time since we had moved in, life felt normal, better than normal. I no longer flinched when checking the mail, expecting another fine. I didn't dread walking to the neighborhood, worried about glares or whispers. Instead, there was a lightness in the air, a quiet sense of relief that spread through the community like a long overdue breeze. Ethan felt it, too. He was more at ease, smiling more often, laughing freely as Max ran alongside him. The tension that had gripped our home for months had disappeared, replaced with a simple, beautiful thing: belonging. I had never set out to take over a neighborhood. All I had wanted was a safe place for my son, a home where he didn't have to fight for something as fundamental as his right to a service animal. But when faced with injustice, I realized that waiting for fairness wasn't an option. Sometimes you had to make it happen yourself. And I did. Linda's departure was a symbolic end to an era of control and fear. But it wasn't just about her. It was about every HOA that overstepped its bounds, every person who had been bullied into submission by people who thrived on rules and power plays. It was about showing that no matter how much authority someone thinks they have, there is always a way to fight back. It wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for every homeowner who had been fined for the pettiest infractions, for every family that had been treated like intruders in their own neighborhood. It was a reminder that these communities weren't meant to be dictatorships. They were meant to be homes. Months passed, and the changes became permanent. The new HOA leadership, made up of fair-minded, reasonable people, focused on maintaining the neighborhood without unnecessary interference. The rules were simple, clear, and designed to benefit everyone, not just those in charge. One evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the rooftops, a neighbor walked by, one who had once been too afraid to speak against Linda. She paused, looked at me, and nodded. "Thank you," she said softly before continuing down the street. I didn't need anything more than that. I had fought back. I had won. And most importantly, my son was safe, free to live his life the way he deserved. And that was all that mattered.